Yeah, no, thank you so much, David. Yeah, I'm also really sorry not to be able to be there in person. But I'm very thankful that you're able to accommodate a virtual talk with very little preparation. So thank you, David, and thank you, Isabel, for trading over. So I'm Frants Jensen. I'm a biologist here at Aarhus University in Denmark. I can pretty much guarantee that at least I'll take the technical side of this down at least a notch. So what I'll be talking about today is individual discrimination of bottlenose dolphin signature whistles using a deep learning framework. And we're going to start by giving you a little bit of an overview of bottlenose dolphins and especially their social and cognitive complexity. Then I'll go through a little bit of what we know about acoustic communication in bottlenose dolphins. They've been studied for quite a long time. They're kind of the white lab rat of delphinids. So please consider that all a very brief overview and not a thorough review at all. Then I'll go through why I think we're moving towards increasing acoustic monitoring and building acoustic monitoring efforts through the use of bottlenose dolphin signature whistles. I'll go through a little bit about our field site where we do our field research and develop these methods. And then I'll go through some of the database that we've developed and also a couple of their machine learning tools that we've been working on. So bottlenose dolphins live in these large fluid fission fusion societies. They come together, stay together for a few hours, split apart again, and they maintain many long-term social bonds in these fission fusion societies. In Sarasota, where we've been studying bottlenose dolphins and where the longest running field study of bottlenose dolphins happens, bottlenose dolphins tend to form either male alliances. These alliances are formed by males in their teens as they associate and find partners that they prefer to hang out with. And then also the other stable type of unit in this social network are bottlenose dolphin mom-calf pairs, and to some lesser degree, female groups with other often related individuals. If we move across the globe over to Shark Bay, where another of the long-running field studies of bottlenose dolphins happen, this one focusing on Tursiops aduncus, so a different species. Here, bottlenose dolphins form much more sophisticated or much more complex alliances of males that compete against one another or between one another for access to females and for mating opportunities. The alliances here can range across 3 different levels. They have the basic pairs or trios of first-order alliances, but those are very fluid. Instead, it's the second-order alliances that are much more permanent. So you see here a social network with yellows being one second-order alliance, blues being a different second-order alliance, and reds being a third second-order alliance. And those are the much more fundamental social unit for males in Shark Bay. And they also associate sometimes in this super alliance where they can aggregate and compete for other against other secondary alliances for mating opportunities. So these complex social lives are also accompanied by a very high cognitive complexity. Delphinids have one of the highest brain to body mass ratios in among cetaceans, rivaling that of non-human primates. They have a large cerebellum size. They have a high encephalization quotient. So many of these anatomical features point to them being quite cognitively sophisticated. They also evolved very exquisite social learning and also problem-solving skills. There's been a lot of studies done on this over the many, many decades, especially by Louis Herman and Adam Peck. And so they're really good at solving problems and solving tasks. So this picture here is from a task that pairs of dolphins were trained to solve in captivity back in 2016. Given the prevalence of these male alliances, of course, it's not surprising that there is also extensive cooperation in bottlenose dolphins. They cooperate among males for herding females and having access to mating opportunities. There's extensive evidence of cooperative foraging. They can cooperatively solve different tasks that you can train them to. So there's a lot of sophisticated problem solving here, and oftentimes in requiring interactions between individuals. And here in the right here, I show a figure from Stephanie King's paper in 21, where they were training bottlenose dolphins to solve a cooperative task in under controlled conditions, and the animals would coordinate using acoustic signals. So in the bottom here, you see a spectrogram. It's labeled. You have time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, and it's color-coded according to intensity. So what you see under right above Reese is a whistle going down. Right over delta is a whistle going up and down, and then right over Reese again, there's another frequency modulated whistle. So they're coordinating to acoustically to solve these tasks. And beyond that, there's a lot of evidence for, of course, the complex alliance formation, and increasingly also evidence from the field with playback studies that these animals have as a concept of who their partners is. So here in the right, we have a figure from Stephanie King in Shark Bay during playback experiments with bottlenose dolphin signature whistles, testing whether or not they can differentiate between second order and third order alliance mates, and showing that they indeed do respond much more to the primary, the secondary, second order alliance rather than third order alliance mates. So acoustically, there's a lot of variation in bottlenose dolphins. They use clicks and foraging buzzes seen here in the very top to forage, to echolocate throughout the environment and to find and catch prey items. But they also have a wide range of communication signals. So here in the bottom, I show some jaw claps, a couple of burst pulses, rasps, and some low frequency narrowband sounds. And I'm just gonna see if I can play a sequence. So this is a sound sequence from an aggressive interaction between a couple of mom-calf, one mom-calf pair, and a couple of males, one male alliance that's interacting with this mom-calf pair. So what you hear most in this sequence are these low frequency narrowband signals, or sometimes also called quacks, that the males are using extensively during these social interactions. There's also a couple of these jaw claps in the start. They're very loud. Then there's a couple of burst pulses right in the middle of the sequence. But these social interactions can be quite complex and consist of a lot of these different social signals that they're using. And we still have a lot to do in order to understand the context and the function of many of these signals, although we have hypotheses for most of them, especially jaw claps, the low frequency narrowband sounds. Beyond these pulsed and low frequency signals, of course, there's also a wide range of frequency modulated whistles. So here's an example of a signature whistle from one individual. And I'm good. So it goes up and down in frequency, and then up and down in frequency again. So these are two loops of the same signature whistle. Oh. So the whistle repertoire of bottlenose dolphins is quite extensive as well. We know a lot about signature whistles, and I'm gonna get to that in one slide. We know much less about non-signature whistles, even though around 40% to 50% of whistles produced by wild, unrestrained animals are non-signature whistles. So here's a slide from one of my students that was looking at non-signature whistle repertoires by Adelaide males, showing that they do have a subset of their non-signature whistle repertoires that they share, and also that they exchange during social interactions, especially at the start of social interactions with other conspecifics. But there's a lot more to do with non-signature whistles. It's a very poorly studied field. What we do know a little bit about is signature whistles, and we've known about signature whistles since the Caldwell's seminal study in 1965, where they showed that each individual dolphin produces a distinct, what they called signature whistle, and that was the predominant whistle when the animals were in isolation, isolated from other conspecifics. So here you have a couple of examples of the time frequency contour, the fundamental frequency contour of 5 different signature whistles from their study. These signature whistles develop early in life. They develop through vocal production learning, and they tend to be stable throughout the lifetime of the individuals. We also know that dolphins can discriminate the conspecific signature whistles. They can recognize familiar conspecific signature whistles, and they recognize individuals based on the pattern of the time frequency contour. So you can remove all the other information, but the time frequency contour shown here in the bottom right, and the animals will still correctly recognize familiar versus unfamiliar conspecifics. So these signature whistles are essential for dolphin societies. They're used for maintaining or even re-establishing cohesion when animals are temporarily separated, but they're also used when groups meet up at sea to exchange identity information and presumably to greet each other after separations. Recognition of conspecifics happen over decades. There's been data showing that even animals in captivity that have been separated from conspecifics because of animals being moved from one facility to another recognize those signature whistles over more than a decade of absence. And that allows for this formation of these very complicated, differentiated social relationships, the formation of stable social bonds, for example, as we see in the male alliances, and complex cooperative relationships. We also know that dolphins differentiate specifically their cooperative partners throughout signature whistles, and that signature whistle exchanges help build or even maintain those bonds at a distance. And finally, there's evidence of referential signaling. Bottlenose dolphins will occasionally copy each other's signature whistles, and there's oftentimes subtle modifications so you can differentiate a copy from an original. And they can do that to attract that individual's attention. So that's been shown in some male pairs and also for mom-calf pairs. So the fact that these signature whistles are so fundamental to bottlenose dolphin societies means there's a large potential for doing acoustic monitoring through listening for, detecting, and ultimately classifying individuals by their signature whistles. So Emma Longden did a seminal study back in 2020 using mark recapture analyses based on bottlenose dolphin signature whistles to get a robust population abundance estimate for the population that she was looking at in Walvis Bay, Namibia, where she found an acoustic estimate of 54 to 68 individuals, and that corresponded very well with a visual estimate of 54 to 76 individuals in this area. That was based on a very small population, and much of the work was done by hand, individually comparing whistle contours and identifying contours that were the same. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and indeed a need for developing automated, maybe if more efficient signal processing pipelines that can allow us to go from raw acoustic recordings over to an overview of the different signature whistles, and ultimately to monitor populations based on their signature whistles, and for subsequent robust field validation with more natural, bigger populations of bottlenose dolphins. So the field site where we operate is based out of Sarasota in Florida. It's the longest running field study of probably cetaceans, definitely of delphinids. It's been running for more than 50 years by now. And in this area, Randy Wells and his team organize regular, both continuous year-round surveys of the local bottlenose dolphin population. Is around 160 to 170 individuals big, depending on the year. And then they do intermittent regular health assessments where they routinely capture animals, implement or conduct a physiological, morphological, and hormonal health assessment of these animals, and then release the animals back into the wild. So this allows for a lot of detailed work to be done with these animals, both during the captures and afterwards. All the individuals down here that have been captured are also freeze-branded, and that greatly facilitates following these animals year over year and throughout their lifetime. I'm part of an aggregation of some 4 other PIs looking at acoustic communication of these animals, including Leila Saig, Peter Teig, and Vincent Yannick. And we look at communication through a lot of different methods. First of all, throughout the last 35 years, during these captures, animals that have been captured have been implemented with suction cup hydrophones, and that allows us to collect whistles from each captured individual and to relate those whistles specifically to known individually identified animals. We implement playback experiments both during the captures and with wild animals to empirically test hypotheses for communication and cognition and behavior of these animals. We implement or instrument animals with D-tags, sound and movement recording tags, right at the end of the captures. And those tags then keep recording both the sounds and the movement of the animals throughout the next 6, 12, 18, up to 24 hours after their health assessment is completed. And finally, we do acoustic monitoring, both to understand the soundscape variability and ultimately also to understand the distribution and abundance of known animals. We have a recently implemented listening network of 12 near continuous recording stations that record sound throughout the area here. Most of them in the south part, but also some in the northern part. A subset of these listening stations have real-time monitoring capability. They use a Raspberry Pi with Wi-Fi or Iridium connection, and they have solar panels to power them throughout the year. And those stations detect whistles using a relatively simple embedded CNN, and then send those whistles to the cloud where people can then go in and validate the whistles and potentially look at and classify whistles into different signature whistles afterwards. So we think Sarasota Bay is an ideal test bed for both developing and validating signature whistle-based population monitoring methods. We have more than 38 years now of suction cup recordings with individually identified animals and all of their whistles. We're now building a database where we are validating signature whistles from these suction cup recordings before we port them into this database that we can then use to train and evaluate AI identification methods afterwards. We also use this database to understand questions of communication and cognition, including how variable signature whistles are, how they're acquired, how often they change, and they do change occasionally, and other kinds of aspects of how information encoding or other questions of signature whistles. Ultimately, we're aiming to have AI detection methods that can then be ported into the Sarasota Bay acoustic listening network and be used for conservation and monitoring of the resident population down in Sarasota, but also that are generalizable enough that they can be implemented for other populations of dolphins around the world. Yeah. So first up, I'll talk a little bit about the whistle database that we've been developing. This consists right now of, in terms of raw data, we have more than 38 years of suction cup recordings of whistles from known individuals, covering more than 900 recording sessions, 295 individual dolphins, and around 171 dolphins recorded repeatedly throughout the years. So this figure here shows an overview of the signature whistles of 269 individuals that have been recorded in Sarasota. So just a very brief overview of the variability of these animals' signature whistles. So this raw data is gradually being integrated into a database. We're aiming to build a database with hundreds and hundreds of signature whistles per individual, both to understand the variability in signature whistles, but also to understand and evaluate how well we can build methods that generalize from smaller and smaller subsets of signature whistles out into other larger, more variable signature whistles. So we have right now around 61,000 whistles in the whistle database, including around 47,000 signature whistles. We're gradually curating benchmark data sets from this raw database, where we can then use those benchmark database to develop and validate AI algorithms, specifically focusing on recognition of signature whistles and bottlenose dolphins. So a little bit of what we know about signature whistles so far from especially the long-term studies down in Florida. We know that signature whistle contour shape is stable over decades. So here we have some examples of 3 different individuals and their signature whistles recorded over more than a decade apart. So I'm going to see if this works. So this is the same individual recorded across 10 years at intermittent intervals, depending on when it was caught during these health assessments. I'm going to play the second one down here. So this just to show that the overall structure and the time frequency structure of these signature whistles is highly stable over more or less the lifetime of these animals. And there are exceptions. We mainly see those exceptions.
Is that the same over from juvenile to adult, or is it from what are the age differences between those 10 years? Just curious.
I don't actually have the age of the animals here. I can look those up, but I did not check on those at this point. So most of them are caught the first time when they're juveniles, often caught with their dependent mom. So, and the signature whistles tend to crystallize after a couple of months already. So they develop relatively fast for young calves. So it would be more or less the same for a juvenile as these. So there's a lot of information in these contours. You see the top animal F159, F is for freeze brand, has a lot of frequency jumps in his his signature whistle. Those jumps seem to be at least somewhat consistent throughout the signature whistles, and they're not super common for other signature whistles. There are other things that vary a lot from rendition to rendition. We see a lot of overlapping click trains and burst pulses. Those tend to not be stereotyped within a signature whistles, but now that we're putting together the state space, we're actually at a point at which we have identified some signature whistles where the burst pulse component does tend to be stereotyped and present every single time. So one thing that does vary a lot in signature whistles is their sequential structure. So here on the top, you see a signature whistle with a single loop going up and down and up at the end. These loops can be repeated a variable number of times for the same signature whistle. So here, just below the first one, you have a rendition with 2 loops and the end upsweep. You have a rendition with 3 loops, with 4 loops, going all the way up to 11 loops. And those that loop number tends to be very flexible and probably a lot more context dependent. In the bottom here, you see an animal with a discontinuous loop structure. So that has a space in between each loop rendition, but that's not necessary for the signature whistles. It surely helps seeing the repeating loop structure, but not all of the signature whistles have spaces in between repeating loops. Another likely context dependent variation or different subtle or not so subtle modifications that tend to happen with signature whistles. That can be deletions, as you see here in row B, where each of these whistles show a bit of the whistle deleted from the signature whistle. It can be different biphonic structure or amplitude modulations within the signature whistle that are not, those tend to not be stereotyped. And then we have occasional additions to signature whistles that in some cases can be quite extensive. So here you see F296, his typical signature whistle. This is one signature whistle where the burst pulse component tends to be very stereotyped. And then just to the right of that, you see the same signature whistle, but with varying numbers or varying degrees of additions at the very end of one of the loops. And we still have a lot to do to understand this contextual variability of signature whistles. It's a big field. One thing we recently made headway on is to understand some of the changes to signature whistles that happen in the context of COPS. So this is from
I apologize for interrupting. I don't know how to raise my hand so that you can see it.
No.
What proportion of signature, earlier you said that it was just the pitch contour that mattered, but here you have an example signature whistle with like a noise burst. And so I'm wondering, is this one extremely rare individual, or is there like a population, like all the ones off the east coast of Florida use noise bursts and the ones in the west coast use just pitch contours? I'm just wondering how common not just pitch contour is to the signature.
That's a super good question. All of the playbacks that were done to test whether or not animals responded to pitch contours only were done with signature whistles from animals that did not have any other non-contour feature. So we cannot really say whether or not if we deleted, for example, the burst pulse component from this individual signature whistle, whether or not that animal would still be recognized from conspecifics, because those experiments have not been done. That being said, non-contour features are rare, but seen both but seen in all of the populations that we've looked for them. Like we see them in Sarasota, we see them in Shark Bay, where Stephanie King and Richard Connor works. But so it's not like they're something that's only specific to a single population, and that's one of the reasons why we started off doing detection, classification, and clustering based on signature whistle contours. And most of what I'll be showing in this talk, we've gone beyond the contour and we use the entire spectrogram, specifically because we don't necessarily know how important some of these non-contour based features are to animal recognition. Okay. So one of the things we have recently been looking into, this is from a paper coming out in a couple of weeks in PNAS by Leila Saig, where she looked at the signature whistle structure of females either with or without their calf. And in the presence of their calf, signature whistles tend to be shifted upward, but only the maximum frequency of the signature whistle. The main contour tends to be the same location, the same sensor frequency, or the same median contour frequency, irrespective of whether or not you have a calf. But for all of the females she looked at, there was either a subtle or pronounced shift in maximum contour frequency when animals were with their calf. And she interpreted this as a version of motherese, as bottlenose dolphins subtly changing their signature whistle to accommodate in the presence of calf, to help either with social learning or vocal learning, as it has been suggested for in humans, or to help with promoting bonding of the animals. So next up, I'll go through a little bit of the efforts we've done to classify or recognize individuals based on their signature whistles. And we've tried to address a couple of questions here. First of all, whether or not we could automate classification of signature whistles despite the seemingly large variability, especially in loop number. Second, how much we wanted to know how much sample size matters, especially because no matter how many years of data you have, you're always going to have some individuals that are represented with just a handful of signature whistles. And whether or not then secondarily we can compensate for a low sample size of signature whistles by simulating the natural variation in bottlenose dolphin signature whistles. And third of all, and this we haven't gotten so much to yet, is the question of how we extend these methods to entirely new populations where we don't have an existing signature whistle catalog. So that one is much more on our to-do list for the future. These efforts have been done especially in collaboration with the Allen Institute of AI, including Piper Falters, Louisa Van Zeeland, Gracie Ermy, Scott Smith, Janet James, Sam McKennock. And these people are now just recently started a nonprofit called EarthSense AI that you can look more into for following some of their work. So the reason we were interested in AI-based classification, of course, is this is probably preaching to the choir here. CNNs and all the deep learning architectures are really great at finding and extracting patterns. And so this figure here is from a public challenge, data challenge, where with detecting right whale upcalls. Right whales are critically endangered cetaceans not living on the east coast of the US. And so this challenge here was made to detect or evaluate different detectors and how well they were able to perform on North Atlantic right whale upcalls. And so here in the left side, you see a variety of detectors developed throughout these data challenges based on traditional feature extraction. And then in gray, you see deep learning-based detectors, and they just far outcompete traditional feature-based detectors, both in precision and in recall. So our initial approach to bottlenose dolphin classification has been a very simple CNN-based approach. We've developed the initial benchmark data set consisted of 72 different individual bottlenose dolphins, each with 200 signature whistles per individual. Those signature whistles were split into a training data set, validation, and testing. And these, for every whistle, we then construct spectrograms and feed that into our classifier, in this case, a MobileNet V2, and generate predictions. So initially, we're getting really good performance for at our top end for a lot of signature whistles. And here we show how that performance declines as we focus only on a subset of these signature whistles. We know we have 150 signature whistles per individual, and we gradually just ignore a larger and larger part of that to evaluate how well training or prediction accuracy depends on sample size as we decrease our training data set. So here we have a training data set decreasing to 100 signature whistles per individual, 50 signature whistles, 25, and then performance completely plummets once we have 10 or 5 signature whistles per individual. So then we started augmenting the existing, in some cases, very limited training data set. So we do that by introducing natural variation to the limited signature whistles and producing a number of replicates for each signature whistle that ultimately brings us up to a total of 150 training whistles, but from a limited number of, for example, 5 signature whistles per individual or 10 signature whistles per individual. For each individual signature whistle, we stretch it in time with plus minus 10 seconds. We change the pitch up or down by up to 10%. And we mix up the signal with ambient noise from the environment. And that ambient noise condition, we wanted to get a system that generalized well to really novel conditions. So what we did was we went into the open source data produced by NOAA during the Sanctuary Sound project and sampled year-round acoustic recordings from 7 long-term field sites around the US, including Stellwagen Bank in Massachusetts, Grace Reef in Galveston, Florida Keys in Florida, Grace Reef in Georgia, sorry. The Florida Keys, Santa Carolina Islands, Monterey Bay, Olympic Coast, Washington, and the Hawaiian Islands. And so we take natural excerpts or just small excerpts of noise from these conditions and mix up with our known signature whistles at a specified signal-to-noise ratio of -6 to up to a 12, plus 12 dB to simulate just the natural variability in signal-to-noise level that we can see on a acoustic recorder. So in this way, using this data augmentation pipeline, we can take a single signature whistle and we can augment it to generate as many different and independent replicates of that signature whistle, subtly different as we want. So using this data augmentation workflow, we get a lot better performance, especially at low sample sizes. So here we have the black and red curves. They show the same as before, validation accuracy, and especially important, the test set accuracy. And then the blue here is a new data set that we developed by mixing up the test set, these raw suction cup hydrophone recordings, into a data set or into a noise from our passive acoustic listening network at realistic signal-to-noise ratios. So again, this is data noise conditions that their network has not really been trained for, but we're hoping that it would generalize from distinct sound noise conditions to pick up specifically on the signature whistle contours. Was there a question in there? Okay. So ultimately, we're getting reasonably good performance with this basic CNN. We then continue this development. Now we're trying to go beyond CNNs to a transformer-based classification. We're using a dyno developed by Facebook, a dyno vision transformer. It's a self-supervised vision transformer network. And what some of the benefits are that it's capable of focusing on objects of interest and images to a remarkably high degree. And it's also able to categorize objects into groups based on physical properties, even in cases where it's not been trained for it. So these are images embedded into a latent space using this dyno transformer. And you see how especially the animal species falls out very well, even though it was never classified specifically to or trained to classify any of these properties. So now we're taking this transformer-based network. We're taking spectrograms of signature whistles as an input to a dyno model. This dyno backbone is pre-trained on ImageNet 1K, and we're using the dyno backbone to generate latent features or latent space representation of the spectrogram. And then we visualize that latent feature space using t-SNE, and we also use the latent feature space to predict whistle identity using a support vector machine framework. So these initial results are really, really promising. We're still missing some progress here, but initially training a support vector machine with 40 known signature whistles per individual and evaluating on the remaining 160 whistles gives us a very high F1 score of 0.95. If we extend this and train with 160 signature whistles out of 200, we get an F1 score of 0.98. And this is on a benchline data set of now 100 dolphins with 200 signature whistles. So we've expanded the baseline data set a little bit. This is all work done by Matt Heyer here in my lab that's now continuing some of these efforts. One big caveat here is we still haven't evaluated these classification models.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry. You just said something provocative. 100 dolphins, 200 signature whistles. Are you saying that dolphins have more than one signature whistle per dolphin?
No. 200 replicates of the same signature whistle for each dolphin, but independent replicates.
Okay, never mind. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so one big caveat here is performance has not been quantified with signature whistles merged with acoustic noise yet. It's only evaluated on these clean suction cup hydrophone recordings. So this is something we still need to build in. So just to summarize, so far we have a reasonably accurate classification of known signature whistles, and that's feasible even with relatively low sample size, as long as we do realistic data augmentation with those few signature whistles. For each, so far it looks like classification of signature whistles using this latent feature space may be more accurate. One of the reasons we wanted to move towards a latent feature space classification was it's easier to allow for things like anomaly detection, classifying signature whistles of individuals that were not in our training data set. And potentially we could extend it for complete unsupervised clustering. So it's easier for us to take something that works well in Sarasota and expand it out to other populations, as long as we can evaluate how well it works in Sarasota using our known signature whistle database there. One question, we have a lot of questions that we're still thinking about, but one of the things I'm very skeptical of is whether a latent feature space from a transformer model trained just on image data is really ideal. So we're thinking of how to potentially pre-train or pre-train their transformer model to get a more domain optimized feature space that can better allow for classifying or even clustering signature whistles in the future. So with that, thank you all for listening. I'd like to give a shout out to especially Leila Saik, who's been fundamental in collecting all of the data for the signature whistle database, and who's organizing a lot of the initial labeling, committing of data. I'd like to also acknowledge the initial AI development team from AI2, and then our funding initially from Vulcan Machine Learning Center for Impact and Dolphin, as well as Dolphin Quest, the Link Foundation, and the Office of Naval Research. Thank you.
Thank you, Frants. Anyone questions?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, are these signature whistles sounds that they just use to identify themselves, or do they actually have a meaning, but you know, they are also so different between each dolphin that we use to identify them? And if it's just, you know, a sound that they use to identify themselves, is this something that we also observe in other animals, or is this specific to dolphins?
One, they're most definitely sounds that they use to identify themselves and to identify conspecifics. That being said, there's a lot of variation in signature whistles that we still do not understand. Some of the contextual variation we're starting to get an understanding of, but a lot of their modifications that we see in signature whistles during natural social interactions, we still have not figured out what the purpose of them are. We know some information is encoded in the rate of signature whistles. Animals that tend to be under, that seem to be under more stress tends to produce signature whistles at a higher rate. At a lower interloop interval or shorter interloop interval, so they're closer together. But yeah, there's a lot more information on that front. What was the second part of the question?
Yeah, if this is something specific to dolphins or also other animals, are just this signature kind of sounds?
No, that's a great question. It's definitely shown for bottlenose dolphins. It's studied, signature whistles are studied extensively in bottlenose dolphins. It's likely that a lot of the other delphinids produce some sort of signature whistles. We've gotten increasing evidence from other species of delphinids that they also have at least some types of signature whistles. Animals that live in permanent social groups, including orca and pilot whales, the question is a little bit more. I think there's a lot more doubt of whether they have individually specific signature whistles or instead have evolved group-specific contours or repertoires. So I'd say at least many of the delphinids are producing signature whistles, but some of them we're still, like, the jury is still out for.
Thank you.
Hi, Frants. Great talk. Thank you so much. It's so much work. I had a quick question of, do you have much information on how the signature whistles fall along lineages? I know a lot of Leila's work years ago showed that the males, young males, calls tend to look like the moms, and I know we showed that in our lab too. Females, it was questionable. Do you have information over generations? What's going on with those the contours?
Yeah, Layla is actually revisiting that question right now. So I cannot, I should not be saying much more about what she has found, but there's definitely some evidence of contours that do show very significant similarities within lineages, but she's revisiting right now this very question.
And the other quick question, just to follow up, I know the Marine Mammal Research Foundation, Sam Ridgway's group over there had reported that they found a second signature whistle. This is related to what you had asked before in their group of animals, which seemed to be a group call that they all shared. And then but all the animals still had their own signature whistle. Have you found anything at all like that amongst these subgroups or groups?
No, but I love all of these questions. We have a few incidents where we during periods when we have D tags on animals and they're roaming out they're in the wild and interacting with the conspecifics. We have a couple of incidents of tagged males interacting with other conspecifics, and this is after our focal follow has ended. But where those males and some of the non-conspecifics, we don't know the identity of which conspecifics they're associating with at this point, but started what is probably accurately called chorusing with one type of non-signature whistle that they were emitting all at more or less at the same time. 3, 4, 5 different individuals emitting the same non-signature whistle contour at the same time.
Thanks so much.
Whether or not that's a little bit similar to what is found in San Diego, I don't know, but I expect it's something similar to that. We do have periods when dolphins change their signature whistle. So these males do occasionally switch over to a different signature whistle that reflects or resembles more their partner's signature whistle. It's rare, but it does happen. So in those cases, those animals then have a secondary signature whistle. And we do have examples of an adult male with a bonded partner who has a new signature whistle, but still occasionally produces his juvenile signature whistle.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks so much. That's great. Thanks.
Hey, Frants, great talk. Awesome. Huge amount of work. It's excellent. I just wanted you to say, because I think you sit in an interesting spot as a bioacoustician who studies animal communication and has at least dabbled, or perhaps more than dabbled, in to the computer science side of machine learning. If you could talk a little bit
Mostly dabbled.
Yeah. If you could talk a little bit about like where you think automation could go, like where your students spend huge amount of time annotating, or what do you think the low-hanging fruits are for, you know, people in this room who are experts on the computer science side, or where you think, just from your experience, the real hard nuts are going to be in terms of you don't necessarily understand or see a way where computer machine learning is going to bring us forward on. Thanks.
I think one of the issues that I look forward to seeing some creative opportunities for is parsing out some of the much more complex vocal interactions that we see in the field with, for example, DTAC recordings, where it's not just signature whistles being exchanged. It goes beyond it's animals moving from exchanging whistles initially to starting to pop at each other or emit jaw claps at each other, to starting some of these complex like coordinated quack series to presumably coordinate motion with their partner. Like, I think there's a lot to do to understand and link together sequences of acoustic data to behaviors and behavioral changes in animals. And that's such a complicated question.
Okay, thanks.
So I stick to the easy part and just classify some signature whistles.
Yeah, you and me both. Do you think it's an annotation issue? Do you think it's that creating the data set on which the machine learning can happen is the challenge? Or do you think there's where do you think that challenge is in your personal experience so far?
I think probably to some degree collecting the data sets and then annotating, but with the biological context necessary to ask biology questions, right? And that's, I think, the really hard part. It requires some sort of focal follows or maybe drone follows that can start to link up what the animals are doing acoustically to what they're doing behaviorally. I think that would be really, really interesting to be able to do, but man, it's complex to do.
Any other questions from our group?
Thank you for the great talk. So I was just wondering if you could tell us what your experience with conducting playback experiments with dolphins in the wild was like. How would you change how you do the same experiments in the future? And I think we've also at SETI started to think about some of these questions, but it'd be great to hear from you and see what your take on this is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've done in Sarasota, and this is mainly Vincent Janik and Leila Saik that have been doing most of these playbacks. But most playbacks have been done to animals doing the health assessments, oftentimes using animals held by people and then with a speaker to one side and looking at head turns either towards or away from the speaker as a response variable. We've done over the last 5 years, we've started to do more and more playbacks to wild animals after the health assessments, both with D-tags on animals and also occasionally with drones to follow and track behavior from a drone perspective. We've had issues with unexpected responses, especially aversive responses during the initial playbacks we did to wild animals after health assessments, either because they were a little sensitized to strange sounds or because their signal to noise ratios that we were playing back was odd for them, or it was a novel stimuli that came out of the blue without, for example, preceding clicks of conspecifics that they could hear. So recently, we've started incorporating preceding click trains into playback so that you have some information that a conspecific is available or is in an area before you start to hear a signature whistle and can pass that out. But otherwise, yeah, I'm not sure what to, I think our success so far has been like we've had much more success looking at and doing drone based follows to observe playback responses. And that's also something that Stephanie King has really had a lot of success with in Shark Bay. So more, I'd say it's definitely easier from extracting real response variables from a drone perspective than from a D-tag perspective. What you do get from the acoustic tag perspective is receive levels and things like this that can be important for if you're interested in things like those response functions, how your response varies as a function of loudness of the signal.
I have one final question, then I'll stop asking questions.
No.
You know, I was the guy, I don't know if you saw the previous talk, I was doing generative modeling.
Yeah.
I would wonder what would happen if your drone made a new signature whistle that you know wasn't a part of their group. You know, what could you start some kind of an interaction with, okay, click, 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 brand new signature whistle, and you're always using that when the drone is out there so that, you know, it's sort of introducing itself as a new individual. Have you ever considered trying something like that?
It's like we've thought of generative algorithms for either producing hybrids between two known signature whistles or producing completely novel signature whistles. And it's something I'd love to discuss more about. from a real-time perspective, that's really that sounds very futuristic. So I don't think we've been considering anything like that, especially because the drone doesn't really have a hydrophone in the water. But yeah, it is interesting whether or not we could come up with experiments that implemented real-time novel signature whistle playbacks. So it might be more from a buoy perspective. We have at Hui, Aaron Mooney's lab has a buoy with a speaker attached that you can send signals to and transmit playbacks from. So that might be smarter than a drone, perhaps.
Thank you, Frants. We really appreciate this talk, and sending best to you and your growing family. And
Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks for staying up so late on your end. All right.
Of course, I love this. Thank you for accommodating my online talk.
Sure. Thank you.